I'm George Galloway, and I present Kalima Horra on Al Mayadeen television. Here we are in London. I speak my words freely, either in Parliament, on television, here on the streets of London. Kalima Horra means free word. That's what I speak. So Kalima Horra is a two-way conversation. Check it out on Al Mayadeen television. Welcome to Kalima Horra with me, George Galloway, on Al Mayadeen television, coming to you from London, but discussing an issue that is beginning to trouble the entire world. Tik-tock. Tik-tock is the clock ticking for free social media. Are the forces that once dominated the so-called mainstream media now moving their tanks onto the lawns of what might be called citizen journalism, whereby everyone with a phone or a computer can have their say and can expect a significant number, perhaps, of people to read or listen to what they have to say. I say TikTok because that's the proximate reason for this discussion. TikTok, which many of us thought was a channel where young children did karaoke acts, turns out, according to the administration in the United States, to be a subliminal way that the Chinese Communist Party can influence the young people of the world in the science of Marxism-Leninism. It is, of course, perfectly absurd. But that's what Donald Trump said. He said he was going to ban TikTok from the United States of America. Unless, of course, they wanted to sell it to him, or at least to Microsoft, one of his tame, globalized giants from the social media, from the electronic age. You might say that sounds a little like a shakedown. Either we ban you or we buy you. But that's what has now happened in the United States. And we don't know at the time of recording whether TikTok will agree to sell. The Chinese, of course, and TikTok themselves completely deny any nefarious purpose to TikTok. They say it's just a giant karaoke machine. Now, karaoke machine or not, social media has now considerable power. I myself have the best part of 2 million followers on social media, which is very much more than any audience I could reach on any channel except Al Mayadeen television. I can speak directly to people because I have my own social media platforms, but they depend on the owners of those platforms allowing me to speak freely. Now, in my case, they do. So far, they have. But more and more, people who take a querulous line, people who question more, are finding themselves either shadow banned, some of my young experts here will explain what that means, or somehow marginalized and even in extremis, excised from the platform altogether. This is particularly so on highly charged political issues concerning the Middle East. If you are a consistent, strident, vocal supporter, say, of Palestinian rights, you're very likely already to have come a cropper. Find your post disappearing, being suspended for 24 hours or a week or more, and, as I say, in extremis, removed from the platform altogether. Now, I'm not arguing, my guests might, for absolute freedom of speech. As a matter of fact, there is no such thing as the absolute freedom of speech. If I were to libel one of my guests here by telling an absolute untruth about them that was damaging to them, they could punish me severely in the courts, and rightly so. If I was taking to social media to stir up racial or religious hatred, for example, such that it might lead to physical attacks and bigotry and discrimination against one group or other in the society, then there are laws already existing to deal with that. There's no freedom of speech for terrorists, in my view. Once upon a time, the cutthroats of ISIS and Al-Qaeda had hundreds, maybe hundreds of thousands of accounts on social media through which they were openly proselytizing for their wicked cause and even showing hideous, ghastly videos of the condign punishment that they were dishing out to those they considered to be heretics or disbelievers. So no freedom of speech, as far as I'm concerned, for terrorists. That would be perfectly ridiculous. But if you ban people from saying things that you think, but the person writing them didn't necessarily think, was likely to stir up racial and religious hatred. This is the grey area into which any sensible person would agree. Care has to be taken. There have to be guardians of the public realm. But the perennial question from Roman times is who will guard the guards? Who will pick the guards? Who will ensure that the guards are not misusing the power of guardianship that they have been given? Now, at the moment, the hammer is on China over Huawei and TikTok and the rest. But most of the big, powerful social media companies are Western-owned companies. And they are beholden to the governments, the states in which they are based. Does anyone really believe that Facebook, Twitter are not influenced by the state policy of Britain and the United States and other Western countries? Of course they are. Many of the things that the Chinese social media are being accused of are actually already being done by Western social media companies. Hypocrisy, you might call it, in other words. Anyway, enough from me. I've got some very clever people with me today, as always, on Kalima Horra. The first of whom is Dr. Richard Barbrook. He's a lecturer focusing on media freedom and politics. He's a Labour Party member, and he's from the Department of Politics and International Relations at the University of Westminster. Doctor, welcome to the show.
Hello, George.
Where do you stand on these matters? Are you a total free speech man? And if you believe in restrictions, how do we come to a consensus about what those restrictions might be?
I think the problem here is who, as you say, who guards the guardians? Because we're used to having media regulated inside the borders of a nation state. And the problem is now, of course, we have a global media, of which this is an example. You can make a programme in Wembley and broadcast it across the Middle East. And so the question then becomes is how are you going to regulate it? And you talked about China. The Chinese have a very simple way, is they created what was called the Great Firewall of China, where they regulate the internet inside China, because they have 1.4 billion people. It creates a large enough space. The trouble is when you now look at, say, a country like England, it's very small. Could you put a Great Firewall around England? Probably not. So who regulates it? So if in England we decided we didn't like something like Daesh propaganda, the difficulty then becomes it can be uploaded somewhere else, and you're playing whack-a-mole trying to stop it being uploaded.
But we would be demanding, indeed I was one of those who did, that Twitter especially should take down the accounts of
but what they were doing was,
ISIS.
Well, let's remember what they were doing was linking to things like websites which were hosted somewhere else. And there is there's a whole grey area, or it's often called the dark web or darknet, which is completely out, is outside these obvious public channels. And you talk about it. It's part. Something like TikTok is made very easy because it's on people's phones. It's designed for teenagers. The question is, if people are motivated, they can now get hold of this information in a way that they couldn't have done 20 or 30 years ago. So the question is who regulates. It's not just who guards the guardians, but who actually has.
Who does the regulating?
Who does the regulating? Is it the European Union? Is it the People's Republic of China? Is it America? And what we've got, I think, certainly over the last 10 years, is that the Americans are asserting that they are the people who regulate the internet. They're the people who made the original technology. Their companies dominate it. Therefore,
Al Gore invented it.
Well, I think the Soviet Union actually had the idea first, but that's another story altogether. I think they, in the sense, the Americans are asserting as the global superpower, as the great world empire, that they ought to regulate it. And as you said, the whole Israel-Palestine issue is a very good example of that, is that they have, shall we say, a rather peculiar view and particular view on this issue, and therefore they think that the big social media should reflect that view in some way. And they will persecute people who support the Palestinians, but not, say, who are West Bank settlers who are massively racist and fascistic people. So that, I think, is an interesting thing. That we're being made into Americans. And so a lot of this, when you have to say the difference between China and America, is that you have two great, large imperial nations who are basically asserting that their view of the internet should be the one that's dominant.
Shehram Malik, you're a cyber security and network expert. You worked in the Persian Gulf, where there are some restrictions on, I don't know if there's a great firewall around Saudi Arabia, but if there isn't, there soon will be, I suspect. Where do you stand, first of all, conceptually on these issues?
Why are they against TikTok? And this is quite important. The next industrial revolution will be based on artificial intelligence, AI. That's the buzzword out there in the market. Now, AI works best with data. So the more data you put in, the more likely the artificial intelligence algorithm that runs in the background is likely to be. So we use artificial intelligence in our daily lives. Every single day when you use Siri, you use all sorts of other autocorrect. When you have sat-nav, that's all artificial intelligence. Now, it's all based on data. Now, that data, the more data you collect, the more you're able to create precision within all sorts of systems that you're developing. So, TikTok may be doing it, right?
I thought it was just karaoke.
No,
videos.
It's not.
60 seconds.
It's not just karaoke videos. You see, that's the thing. Now you have sophisticated artificial intelligence software, right? So you're using facial recognition. Your details are attached to that facial recognition. Anywhere in the world that you travel to, right? You will be recognized. They will know who you are. For example, they'll be able to bring your profile up. They will basically, based on your TikTok videos, the same with YouTube videos, they'll be able to establish your characteristics. What are you likely to do? So it's not...
Why is it more nefarious for the Chinese to have that capability than, say, Google to have it?
That's hegemony.
Which empire is in control of the world?
Which empire is in control? So information is power. In today's world, right, you could build as many buildings as you like, but the most important asset that you have is not buildings and offices, it's your data centers. Any data center that's impacted, right, and they're spread out throughout the UK, especially East India Dock, is probably the most important location for the commercial well-being of the UK, and Slough. If these two places go, right, Britain will be on its knees.
Well, we must hope that they don't. Now, James Giles, you are the famous young person, the youngest parliamentary candidate in Britain, and a man well used to social media, I know. Viewed from where you sit, what's the role of these social media companies? Should we be regulating them? And if so, how?
Well, I think the key here is a little bit of honesty, because, of course, you've got Facebook, Twitter, Snapchat, WhatsApp, endless Instagram, endless Western-owned social media platforms, which claim to be free to use, free to access, free speech, say what you want sort of thing. Give us your data, but that's, of course, not what they tell people. But it's a place to share things, to stay in touch with people, play games, do shopping. And people buy into it. They think, this is really useful, this is handy, this makes life a bit easier, whether it's pictures of their cats, and then they'll target you for cat food, by the way, or whether it's sharing political posts out there to the world. And the West want people to believe that it's a free space, that it's,
Public square.
yeah, public square, say what you want, do what you want, speaker's corner, your time to shine, as it were. But then, of course, you get these apps from the East come over, and you've got TikTok, which is the case in point today, which they claim is offering the same. Come and sing karaoke to us, share it with your friends. Come and share videos talking about X, Y, or Z. And one of the reasons that America is saying they want to ban TikTok is because of, coming back to Richard's point about that great firewall of China. America and Trump will say, TikTok moderators, the people that are behind the scenes, will actively take down things that are anti-Chinese or mention Tiananmen Square, for instance. And that's one of the reasons why it's dangerous, because people don't realise, but they are falling within that Chinese sphere of influence, this great firewall of China. But, of course, in doing that, what they don't say is, we're doing the same. People every day on Twitter will say, where's my tweet gone? I had 10,000 likes on this tweet this morning. I've now got 500. My follower number has just dipped by 500, and Twitter will say, oh, well, they were fake accounts, they were Russian bots, we were just reviewing accounts, we've taken them offline. But of course, in doing so, they are no better than the Chinese. And it's a great hypocrisy to suggest that the Western social media apps are a beacon of free speech and expression, and the Chinese is this evil, nefarious data mining monster that's been created, because they're one and the same. And if you go on YouTube and take a look at RT, underneath every one of those videos, you will have a little message that says, please be aware that RT is funded by the Russian state.
But not the BBC.
But then you go to the BBC, and any such message does not exist.
Exactly.
And so the key is hypocrisy. And
Even more ridiculous is Voice of America.
of course.
I mean, Voice
Yes.
of America wouldn't even claim not to be the voice of America.
Quite. And for as long as you've got the West saying one thing and claiming the other, if America does ban TikTok, then they're creating a great firewall of their own. And they're saying, it's only what we want. And it's jealousy, isn't it? We want all of your data. We want to be regulating the internet. And the very notion that a rival says we can do it too is just so alien, so foreign to them, and so incompatible that they have to
This is
chop
a
it off and
challenge
build their own
to
firewall.
your word, hegemony, isn't it?
It is, absolutely.
That Western and principally American hegemony is challenged by the rise of China in so many ways. The Belt and Road Initiative, China's vaulting economy, second biggest in the world.
First biggest now after pandemic.
Probably after the pandemic, first biggest, and so on. So it's a defense of hegemony, isn't it? Let's hear from Professor Alec Charles, who is principal lecturer in media at the University of Bedfordshire. He's the editor of Media in the Enlarged Europe and co-editor of The End of Journalism. Well, that's a portentous title, Professor. How do you see this whole issue?
I think we have to see that the TikTok issue is divorced from other issues relating to social media. With TikTok, it's very much about security, and of course, it's also about business. And I think one of the most worrying things about TikTok is the way that the President of the United States has sought not only to ban TikTok in the United States, but to ensure that it is sold to an American company. And if that were not worrying enough, what's particularly concerning was Donald Trump's notion that he could ask the American company who bought TikTok to give some kind of donation to the Treasury, some kind of cut of the deal. That's a businessman talking. It's not the President of the United States. Some people have even suggested, some commentators have even suggested that it's the American president behaving like a mobster.
Are we getting into a new era where the filtering and banning of applications becomes the norm?
That's a very interesting question, George. We're in an era in which social media undoubtedly can impact upon election results. Social media can have a very anti-democratic impact. And so we have to balance freedom of expression and social media. If people are being misinformed and indeed disinformed through social media, we're in a very strange position indeed when people are defending social media as having a democratic potential. I see no reason why we can't regulate social media, that social media can be made responsible for what they do.
Is this misinformation of which you speak a new phenomenon, or has it been done before, the likes of Facebook, for example?
I think social media misinformation and active disinformation are undoubtedly underpinned these days by the kind of algorithms which are being used by media companies, which underpin social media. What we know from the Cambridge Analytica case is that they target individuals with messages which they believe will impact upon them. And it does appear that social media, when used in such a way, has an impact upon people's democratic choices.
Are we in the tit for tat era then, in the social media wars?
I think social media has been a so-called new battleground for more than a decade now. Western defense organizations have had social media units in place. Social media has undoubtedly been hugely important in acts of terrorism as in acts of government propaganda on all sides. I think, though, that we are entering into an era in which the impacts are felt so strongly that we have to regulate social media. Social media are not simply blank platforms. They should be regulated in the same way that we regulate broadcasters, or they should be accountable to the law in the same way that publishers are accountable to the law.
Well, as a scholar, what would be your recommendation to the politicians? Are they getting it right, or should they be doing something differently?
I think that politicians should ensure that social media platforms take responsibility for the content that they put out. Some of their content is active disinformation. It's very clear to anybody who then checks up on it that these are simply lies. Content about coronavirus conspiracies, content about safe cures for coronavirus, such as injecting yourself with bleach. This stuff should not be allowed by any responsible publisher or broadcaster. And so social media need to be able to regulate themselves. Social media undoubtedly have a huge part to play in the development of democracy. But what we've seen with social media before is that they haven't, in fact, helped us to develop a political consensus, haven't actually really got together the views of the people. They've been very good at mobilizing. What they haven't been very good at is, in fact, the social side of things.
Controversial stuff, much more after the break. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Kalima Horra with me, George Galloway, on Al Mayadeen Television. Talking about TikTok, TikTok, TikTok is the clock chiming for free social media. Dr. Richard, I was nonplussed really by the professor just before the break, because he was painting as nefarious electoral practice the gathering of details which segment people and targeting them with specific messages attracting them. There's nothing remotely controversial in that for me. For example, like you, I was a very long time in the Labour Party and a Labour Member of Parliament, and I would target people all the time. If I had 10 leafleters, I wouldn't send 5 of them to leaflet the richest households in the constituency, I'd send all 10 of them to leaflet the area most likely to vote for me. This targeting that he spoke so darkly of is merely the refining of pre-existing political practice.
Yes, I think if you think about the newspaper industry, it's divided into different political.
Exactly.
You know, you buy the Guardian if you're a sort of liberal type, the Mirror if you're a more working class Labour, and then across on the right, you know, if you're a crazy Brexiteer, you buy the Daily Express, and posh Tory, you buy the Times, and so on. So that's already. I think what he is nostalgic for is the age of mass television, where you actually had this idea that one TV channel had everybody watching it, and this would create a uniform consensus within a very small nation state. And I think that's the problem people like he have, is that suddenly one of the things social media does is create what's called filter bubbles. Your algorithm keeps rewarding you with more content that reinforces what you already think. So as a lefty, I get fed all sorts of things about the particularly the Labour Party. We all like squabbling with each other, so you get lots and lots about all the internal disputes and also about how much we hate the Tories. But I won't get fed other stuff, which friends of mine who are in, who I know they're in the campaign to remain in the EU, they just get masses of stuff slagging off Brexiteers and saying how wonderful the EU is. And so the algorithm is rewarding, and since it's recreating inside social media, much more like the old style 19th century, early 20th century newspapers. And the difficulty is, as he says, when it comes to regulating it, a lot of our ideas of free speech are actually come from this partisan newspapers, where you are supposed to slag off your enemies, invent stories about them, promise the things that can never be achieved. And
well, politicians have always done that, haven't they? And the politicians you support, you believe are telling the truth, and the politicians you're against, you believe are lying.
And even when you know your politician is lying, you'll still back them up because they're your mates or you're in that team. I mean, so that's part. So as I said, he's talking about this targeting as if it's some great conspiracy. But that is, in a sense, how politics works, actually. And then the question of politicians is to aggregate these groups together around common class interests or different, so other social groupings, and bring them together to form a majority that then becomes the consensus. It's not imposed top down by the BBC.
Well, that is what they're trying to do, isn't it, James? They are trying to hold a prevailing orthodoxy so that there is an inch or two for even fierce debate. But anyone who's outside that prevailing orthodoxy, like me, for example, can have their freedom of speech suppressed.
Oh, absolutely. And it's absolutely ridiculous. I mean, you take, for example, on Twitter, the likes of TV presenter Rachel Riley calling for people like yourself to be, banned from Twitter for no reason other than she disagrees with what you have to say. And it is...
being triggered by him.
Absolutely, yes, as the...
I've never heard of her. I have no idea what you're talking about. But anyway, press on.
One of your 2 million followers.
Indeed. But it's this concept, you're quite right, that you stick within these, very tight scopes of debate, or else you just can't engage. And if the powers that be seek to do that, as they are, I believe, with TikTok and taking away the ability to, speak out against things. There are things that the Chinese want that the Americans, just really would not tolerate on their platforms, I'm quite sure. And, if there was someone Chinese here, yeah, indeed, and vice versa, I'm sure the Chinese would know what those issues are. And they wouldn't be able to speak out there on, say, Twitter without facing usually a shadow ban. And so what the West do, or what these companies do, which are in the West's hands, is they don't usually actually expel these people from their platforms. They don't actually say, you're not welcome here anymore. But because, as you said earlier, it's all done through very clever algorithms and data.
And demonetization.
Indeed, they control what and who others see. And so if you are an outspoken critic of, take for instance, the Palestinian issue,
yes,
and against Israel, you may find yourself shadow banned. And so your tweets are not being seen, even by your own followers, by people who have explicitly said, I want to hear from Mr. Smith. And it just strikes me, come back to what I said earlier, as a hypocrisy.
Yeah, look, I mean, let's cut to the chase, Shehram, on this. If I were, which I won't, to post this evening the case that the explosion in Beirut was caused by an Israeli rocket or bomb, I wouldn't do that because I don't believe it. But if I did...
Lots of people who have, though, have
they have. But if I did,
crazy.
I can be sure that in one way or another, as young James has just explained, the power of my message would be somehow mitigated. The number of people who would hear it would be less than if I were to opine the opposite, for example. That's what's going on, isn't it?
I mean, just picking up on James's point, last year, the Twitter account of the Prime Minister of Pakistan was reported to Twitter for sending tweets in support of the Kashmiri cause, Imran Khan's Twitter account. So you've got to, so I'll pick up on two important points. So one thing that the professor mentioned is the absolute nefariousness of these algorithms. So we've got to understand that first. So initially, like you said, you would only send your people to areas where, you had a very good chance of winning somebody over. But what you're doing is you're putting that leaflet through the letterbox. Now it's up to him or her whether they pick it up, read it, or they chuck it in the bin. So that's a choice they have. Now with social media, it's very, very different. On average, a person checks his phone 57 times a day. And they use keywords, words that are basically devised based on your personal profile, which in some cases has known to be 95% accurate. Words that impact you. It's to trigger a reaction, which is more sinister because now what you're doing is you're taking away their choice. You're forcing them to do something which they believe is right and they believe they're free to do it, but they're actually not. So it is sinister. You see?
I think the other thing is you were talking about canvassing. But if you're sending people to the wealthy area to canvass for Labour, it might be right if you're just doing a general mail out. But here you can actually find the 10% who do support Labour. That's the key thing also, is to be able to go have much more fine-tuned way of looking at this audience.
Well, look, let's go to Beijing and talk to Professor Benjamin Chow, who is the Academic Dean for Asia Programs at Paris School of Business and also Chair and Professor at the Southwestern University of Finance and Economics in China. Professor, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you.
Do you think controlling platforms like TikTok is a step forward for democracy in America?
Thank you for your question. I think the TikTok case is neither an economic one or connected to national security 100%. I think it's more a political one and a myopic one. Just so many critics have argued that Trump wanted TikTok to be out as soon as possible because it is now so close to the US presidential election, and the TikTok users are mainly under 30s who do not support Trump much. I would say from a practical angle, so far almost all countries have been accused of security breach of some sort at some point in time. For the current case, however, the Trump administration has provided no specific evidence that TikTok has made US user data available to the Chinese government. On the other hand, Snowden revealed that the US has a mass surveillance program. The most notorious of all is the PRISM program, which has direct access to servers of several technology giants in the States, and the US is taking advantage of the data collected from all around the globe.
What about the platforms blocked by China? Do you think these blockings were done for commercial or for security reasons?
All right, I think it's a fair question. Perhaps the first question, though, that we need to ask is whether Facebook and the like are purely economic enterprises with rather directly and actively involving in overthrowing foreign governments. Quite a few scholars have argued that the US social media companies' involvement in the color revolutions worldwide is not trivial. I think every country should have the right to defend its own country. And the second question is whether we notice the nuances of blocking and asking for compliance. China did ask Google to comply with the Chinese laws, but Google chose to pull out from China in 2010 without complying. But this year, Trump did not give any chance of compliance for TikTok, but asked TikTok to sell to a US company, give quote unquote commission to the US government, or risk being shut down. I think it's fundamentally different.
Is blocking and controlling platforms and social media good for democracy? Should people accept it?
Well, I think it's a good question. The tricky part of the internet businesses is that it is largely transnational. We must then admit that there is no single internet businesses that could satisfy the laws of all countries. At the same time, there is also limited actions a single jurisdiction can do to block or shut down an internet business. In fact, a complete and a clean shutdown is never possible in some sense, because people can still use VPN to access any websites anywhere. Of course, different business models will be affected differently. For example, although a typical user, when accessing Google from China, will return a website not accessible type error, but most university students know how to get around this.
Well, look, we've been to China. Let's go to the United States. Helen Bajnitsky from New York is an American journalist and political commentator. Helen, when is shutting down a social media platform a democratic action, and when is it an anti-democratic one?
I would say that, at least right now, it's a very anti-democratic action, because it seems that with the US-controlled social media platforms like Twitter and Facebook and YouTube, which is, of course, a subsidiary of Google, they are all cracking down increasingly on, well, state-run media, on foreign officials, on anybody with any affiliation with state-run media are now getting little warning labels next to their names. They're tightening up control of information, and having an outsider like TikTok, which, I mean, it's right now it's mostly known for having these short little snippets of people dancing around to music and lip syncing, but could suddenly transform into a political platform at any given time, especially as the other platforms increasingly censor. So the US wants more and more control of just social media, the interactions between people around the world, and control of the flow of information.
So how would you describe social media platforms? A tool for democracy, or a tool to buttress the hegemony of the power of those that already have it?
I would say definitely a tool of maintaining Western hegemony. I think they started as a tool for facilitating democracy, and they're still coasting on that reputation. I mean, everyone talks about Twitter facilitating the Arab Spring and all that, but more and more, as the dialogue has become more controlled, as more and more topics are declared off limits, it's definitely become a tool of maintaining this very rigid, narrow stricture of thought that if you go outside, you get blocked, you get banned, sometimes you'll get banned and they won't let you even, you'll be silenced temporarily on Twitter, and you can't even mention why you've been banned, and then if you do mention it, you get banned again. So it is definitely becoming more and more of a tool for maintaining Western hegemony. You just try to say certain things on Facebook or Twitter, and you're going to find yourself in a very anti-democratic situation.
So what's the future then? Are we heading into tit for tat, social media wars, and firewalls, and people developing their own platforms for their own territories?
Yeah, unfortunately, I see it headed deeper into this control mechanism. I mean, Unfortunately, the US and platforms like Facebook and Twitter have this sort of symbiotic relationship where the tech platforms are used as sort of an end run around the Constitution by Big Brother, big government. Basically, they can get around the fact that they're not allowed to censor by the First Amendment. They're not allowed to do unreasonable search and seizure by the Fourth Amendment. So they just use these social media platforms to dig through people's personal lives and silence them and all of this. And so the more and more they don't want people from other countries. They don't want us comparing notes. They don't want the victims of US empire comparing notes with the people whose tax dollars are funding US empire. So it's increasingly, I think, especially as if the US gets away with this TikTok power grab, and if they go after WeChat and all of this, it's going to be more and more balkanized. And but they don't want alternatives. They don't want us realizing that there is a world outside the prisons that they've built for our minds.
What is the future then? The more I've listened to the debate, the more I've questioned my own initial thesis. Why can't we, especially for Americans who believe in the free market and so on, and to mix the ideological metaphor, why can't we just let 1,000 flowers bloom and let people pick them as they choose?
It was an easier question to answer maybe 15 years ago, but cyber war is today's reality. Your cyberspace is crucial to the country's economic and security backbone, right? Cyber wars are ongoing, continuous. You know, you don't have to send an army to the front, right, with 20,000 tanks and men and what have you. These wars are ongoing. So countries, like they have to secure their borders, now also have to secure their cyberspace, right? That's the key here. Now, what internet is allowing nefarious organizations, countries backed by the state, organizations backed by states to do is take countries down. Look what happened to Iran. Iran was the first country to suffer cyber warfare, an attack through cyber Stuxnet, for example. And what Iran did afterwards was brilliant. And to my mind, that is where the world is headed, which is you create what is called not internet, but intranet. So interconnect everything within your geographical boundary. And then basically what will sprout from that is platforms that are local. Because see, democracy is local. I am voting for my local MP. I do not want somebody in Russia, somebody in the US, somebody in Brazil to tell me what to do. I want to have that discussion with my neighbor, and I want my neighbor to tell me what his view is, but I don't want anybody else's view because that is my democratic right. Okay? So we have to see democracy confined to international borders. And for that, what a lot of countries will do moving forward to protect their cyberspace, they will actually you will have parallel networks. You will have the internet and you will have the intranet. Now, a lot was spoken about China. What China does is your internet websites, HTTP, so one is the hypertext markup protocol, works off port 80, then HTTPS works off the secure websites, work off HTTPS port 443 or port 8080. Those are actually blocked in China. So the standard internet is not viewable in China. However, they have something equivalent. Iran has something equivalent. But countries who are secure, who feel threatened, who insecure rather, will actually head in that direction. Because now it's not just people's freedoms that are on the line, it's your national security that's on the line, which is the key.
Interesting. Richard, this question of national borders, I know from what you've said earlier, you're not really a nationalist of any kind. You presumably would balk at the idea of a great firewall of Britain, would you?
You could, I think, to go back to the previous contribution, the people when China set up its Great Firewall, it was seen people criticised it. It's this totalitarian control. It's about censoring information. You can't access things, about Tiananmen Square or Falun Gong or something. But it actually turned out to be economically an absolutely brilliant move because it created this huge internal market which allowed them to do things like WeChat, or TikTok is a spin-off of a Chinese platform. And they've actually now, in things like e-commerce and all the and lots of other things, the advance of 5G, the rise of Huawei, is actually because they created this very large protected market and stopped the Americans going in. Okay, as one of the early contributors said that Google could have actually got in, but they didn't for political reasons back home. But and the way I would say that, you know, maybe people will look back in 10 or 20 years' time and say, well, the big mistake the EU did was not create a great firewall of Europe, because if you created, which is the richest economic zone, if you'd done that, we would have our own versions of eBay and Amazon.
See, that's the thing.
And very foolishly, we bought into this idea that somehow Silicon Valley was the future.
Was the oracle.
Yeah, I mean, I wrote many years ago co-wrote this article called The Californian Ideology, where people believed this. And the Americans, of course, they believed in open architecture and free markets because they were the superior, they were the world empire. It was the end of history. Now they've got this challenger who didn't believe that, who took a different path of development. And suddenly we see ourselves in Europe is that we sort of missed the boat because we didn't actually make a competitor to Silicon Valley. We don't have the equivalent of Shenzhen. We don't have these platforms. And this is a real problem. The interesting thing is we do have Nokia and Ericsson who can build 5G. That's the only thing.
Well, only a couple of years at least slower than Huawei could have. James, that's the point, isn't it? Technically, we can make our own eBay. We can make our own Facebook. What is Facebook? It's just a board on which you write. There's no reason, you don't have to be Einstein to, in fact, you don't even have to reinvent it. You just have to use the same technology. And isn't that the future, this 1,000 flowers blooming that I'm talking about? That, you know, you and I can start our own Facebook. I don't know, call it Headbook or
why not?
Backbook or something.
Handbook.
Handbook. Who's the? Call it handbook.
Absolutely.
Isn't that the future? I mean, are we worrying unnecessarily about these tyrants? Because, as our Chinese guest made clear, you can't actually stop the internet. You can't stop the world and get off it.
No, you never can. And that's what gives me hope as a young person is, you know, already we're starting to see alternatives to Facebook and Twitter emerging, you know, things like Parler and other apps that I don't even know the name of yet, which in 6 months, a year's time, you know, will spring up as the next alternative, I don't know, maybe to Snapchat.
TikTok is a good example, isn't it?
It
Came from nowhere.
Yeah, it came from nowhere.
You know, one minute I'd never heard of it, next minute turns out everyone was on it, including me.
Trump only heard of it when they wrecked his rally at Tulsa, which I keep thinking that this is the real reason he wants to get rid of him. He's never forgiven them for making him look like a complete idiot.
Well,
just to explain that, a lot of people on TikTok bought tickets
they didn't
for
even buy
his
them.
rally.
They were free.
They were free, so they reserved tickets. Trump thought 1 million people were going to show up, and virtually nobody did because they were all bogus.
Absolutely.
And it was
Naughty
the young generation.
Yeah. Well, it's like the sort of new rock and roll, isn't it? I mean, there used to be when we were younger, it was always new styles of music, and that's what the older generation got horrified about. And now it's, as you say, it's just, you know, TikTok. It'll probably disappear in 2 years, won't it?
I think it will.
See, the thing is, we live in an age of ideas.
Yeah.
We do not live in an age of products. Product is your idea, what you can do, right? For example, I was reading something the other day. Some of the Israeli, basically officers from Unit 8200 started a company called Argus. And you know what this company does? Take a guess. Our cars these days are controlled by multiple computers. So all these hackers that work for the Israeli army went and started hacking cars, right? So they said, we can hack these cars. We can take control over these cars. So what we'll do is we'll develop a product that protects these cars
From being hacked.
From being hacked. It's an idea.
I'll buy it.
Now that company, I think that company was floated in the stock market for over 200 million pounds. It was just an idea, 4 people working in an office. They developed this protection, this product, and now
Well, they developed the threat and then the protection.
Exactly. So if the internet in its current form, and if the West, more specifically the US, continues to press its hegemony over it, people, countries that are powerful enough or that fall into the Chinese bloc, for example, more specifically, because we're living in that bipolar world now, not unipolar anymore, will then go with that idea. Because what that does is, the Chinese idea, what that does is it promotes localized, right? Localized ideas, localized institutions, localized enterprise. Alibaba, for example, right? Billionaire, right? Absolute billionaire. However, he did it within the confines of his own nation. And there are a lot of nations big enough to cater for their own market. Now, you know, Amazon doesn't operate in every country, for example. But developing an application or a platform like Amazon is not very hard to do.
No, it's not at all.
The worrying thing to me is when people regurgitate information that they've read somewhere, right, and they present it as their own idea. Because I know I've read it somewhere as well. But I had the ability to think and say, right, I can find holes in it. But this person hasn't. But he or she thinks that it's their own idea.
Oh, it's the oracle, yeah. I, you know, on my television and radio phone-in shows, I have people all the time who say, I've researched this thoroughly, which means they've looked it up on the internet. Alas, we've run out of time.
The University of Facebook, yes.
The University of Facebook. Thank you very much indeed for watching and for participating. It's been marvellous for me. I hope it was for you. If it was, see you next time.